Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Julie Oakes Dweck. I'm the chief curator at the Princeton University Art Museum. It is an honor to be here, and it is an honor to welcome you to this vital discussion on Israeli culture, art, artifacts, and texts for a shared future. Unlike countries with centuries-old national institutions, Israel has always had to construct its historical and cultural narratives actively in real time. Its libraries and museums, those within Israel and those attuned to Israel, do more than preserve texts and material culture. They're actively shaping understanding of Jewish and Israeli identity and experience across time and place. As they collect, their interpretations and decisions influence the present, mediating national thought and catalyzing action in very tangible ways. Today, as Israel grapples with democracy, justice, existence, the role of national libraries and museums is especially critical and complex. These institutions have become custodians of traumatic memory, stewards of difficult history, with all the responsibilities for ethical engagement and inclusive representation that come with this. Our session now will explore the pivotal role that museums and libraries are playing in Israel as they bear witness, as they gather evidence from the present to preserve it for the future. We'll examine some of the key challenges they face as they strive through collecting, exhibiting, and programming to navigate a path forward, one now complicated even further by the need for healing. Their critical work in real time raises deeply human questions about how to be responsive to traumatized communities, how to care for people as well as materials, and what it means to listen as an institution. Unlike most museums and libraries, the initiatives we'll be hearing about are taking place during war, amidst actively unfolding crisis. This is work undertaken without the surety of hindsight, without the privilege of pre-existing documentation, without the crutch of already codified narratives. But narration, as we know, is not a neutral act, nor is the process of creating a collection or assembling an archive. Over the last half-century, across several academic fields, archives have become a subject of inquiry that lies at the intersection of the history of ideas, materials, and power. Scholars have shown us that the knowledge and truths that archives gather are themselves produced through systems of thought. Museums and libraries, then, as physical manifestations of the archive, have the capacity to define the limits of historical memory by including some narratives and excluding others. This inevitability raises a question that will at least hover as an undercurrent to our conversation about the role that national libraries and museums should be playing in shaping national narratives. I might note that this is a critical moment in the museum field more broadly, where scholars and practitioners are examining how expressions of national identity shape the civic and public roles of cultural institutions, both overtly and implicitly. What we do know for certain, and what I think we'll see unfold in the next hour, is that libraries and museums serve as absolutely essential fora for dialogue around Israel. To address this topic, we could not have two more distinguished speakers. Our presenters are leaders deeply committed to creating spaces for public engagement, dialogue, and cultural exchange, individuals whose incisive vision has shaped Israel's cultural institutions. Raquel Ukeles is head of collections at the National Library of Israel, where she is responsible for the development of the library's collections and for its digital, cultural, and educational initiatives and institutional partnerships. With an academic background in Islamic and Jewish studies, Ukeles has published and taught broadly on Jewish intellectual history, Arab culture in Israeli society, Jewish and Islamic traditions, and the role of national libraries today. James Snyder has been since November 2023 the Helen Goldsmith Menschel Director of the Jewish Museum in New York, where he has transformed the museum into a space for discourse and dialogue. Snyder was previously executive chairman of the Jerusalem Foundation with its vision for urban cross-communal coexistence, and before that, for 2 decades, he served as director of the Israel Museum, leading the museum through its most prolific growth since its founding. Their array of accolades and academic degrees goes without saying, but I will add that these are poignant moments for their respective institutions. The National Library of Israel opens the doors to its new building in the fall of 2024. The Israel Museum is now commemorating the 60th anniversary of its founding. And as we shall learn soon, the Jewish Museum is participating in global conversations like never before. We thank you both, Raquel and James, for being here. A quick word about format. Each of our speakers will speak in turn now for about 10 minutes, sharing and also showing, you'll see that we are a visual tribe, how they've led their institutions to collect, interpret, and exhibit since October 7th. Then we'll gather together on the stage and converse for about 30 minutes before opening the floor for questions from you, our audience. With that, I thank you all so much for being here, and I thank our speakers for what they're about to share.
Thank you so much, Julie. I'm truly honored to be here. Thank you, Chancellor Ruben Schwartz, for inviting me. Thank you to Dr. Tamara Newman for planning the convening and for conceptualizing this panel. In Israel, we feel that we're all the time in the weeds, and it's a wonderful opportunity to take a step back and to think more broadly about these critical issues of our time. I think this whole panel has an agenda, and that is to situate the role of cultural institutions in the broader space of Israeli society and in the Jewish world as well. And hopefully what we will discuss is the ways in which libraries and museums play a critical role in society, both in the way they hold the center and also in providing paradigms and models for how to shape society. I want to start by introducing a dialectical role of a national library in general. Libraries are spaces of infinite potential. As Borjas beautifully described, the library is a symbol or a reflection of the universe. What's beautiful about a library is that it can contain almost infinite stories. We heard Tal talking about the importance of building new narratives. A library is one of the few places where opposing viewpoints sit very comfortably together on the shelf. And I don't say that trivially. It means that a library has a capacity to encompass difference, diversity, and conflict all at the same time without choosing sides. When you talk about a national library, there seems to be some kind of paradox, or, I want to use the word of dialectic, because I don't think it's resolvable. I think it's there. And that is, the role of a national library is first and foremost not to take on the universal, but to take on the literary heritage of the nation, however construed. If I had more time, I would love to tell you the story of the National Library of Israel, which is actually Israel's oldest public institution today, about 133 years old. And it has gone through many stages of development that, to me, very much reflect the development and the stages of the creation of modern Israel. I would even go as far as to say the National Library of Israel is a microcosm of modern Israel. And even just in this sentence about the National Library Law that was passed, fun fact, unanimously in the Knesset in 2007, that you see that the library, first and foremost, plays two national roles. We are a national library in the geographic sense of the state of Israel, which we interpret as broadly as possible. And we are a national library in the ethnic sense, representing the Jewish people worldwide. And there's even a third role in the National Library Law, which is that we serve as the premier research library in the humanities. And so I hope you can see right away that all the different tensions in Israeli identity, Jewish and democratic, particularist or universal, are situated in the three missions of the National Library. And these balances or dialectics find themselves manifested in our five main collections. that we have 3 national collections with the different ways of understanding the nation, as I just described. The Judaica collection, our Israel collection, and we have a national sound archive that focuses on Israeli and Jewish music. And then we have 2 research collections that allow us to lift up our heads and to look more broadly, first at the region, at our Islam and Middle East collection, which is actually celebrating 100 years this year, and a general humanities collection, which is the window to the world. And so we see how these 3 missions find their expression first and foremost in our collections. And these collections allow us to play within and across all these different boundaries. And it's very much that space of inclusion that Borjas is envisioning. That yes, we are collecting the national heritage, but we also are all the time looking for broader and broader ways to collect cultural memory. In the fall of 2023, we launched a new era at the National Library. I started working at the National Library at the end of 2010, and from the day I arrived, we were planning this move. And it's not just a physical move, it was an existential move. Because the library, which historically was predominantly connected to the Hebrew University as a research institution, has transformed into becoming much more than an institution of memory, but to be a thriving, open, engaging cultural institution. And the architecture signifies all of these values. The huge windows, the openness, there are no fences around the library, and the public is invited in. We were supposed to open on October 17th, 2023. On October 6th, everything was ready. We had been planning for literally years, a week-long extravaganza. There were hundreds of people who were flying in, including the director of the National Library of Morocco. And on October 7th, our world fell apart. On October 8th, we shut down all the parties. We canceled all the happenings, and then we had a question: what is our role? What is the role of a national library in crisis? And after several rounds of discussions, we came to the conclusion that we needed to become available for the public. And so we pivoted to getting our building open for the public. We opened 3 weeks later, and since then, we've been full. People have come from all over the country. In the months from October 7th onward, from October 29th onward when we opened, people said that this was the only place in the country where one could breathe. Part of it was the gorgeous architecture, which is the Swiss architects Herzog and de Meuron, and it's really, I've never had a spiritual connection to a building until we moved into this National Library. But part because the library holds this center. Just look at this picture, right? Sitting at one desk. This is a cross-section of Israeli society. Because the library is one of the few places in Israel where everybody is welcome and everybody finds their place. And that's, again, goes back to Borjas' notion of a library being able to encompass universal stories. After October 7th, we didn't want to just be available for the public. But on October 9th, we got to work. The first work we do is as a library. And that is that our role as the institution for collective memory in Israel and for the Jewish people worldwide is to start documenting. And my team and I, on October 9th, started documenting. And we have built over time a massive project, unprecedented in scale, definitely in Israel, and we haven't found an example anywhere in the world of how do you document in all its diversity, in all its complicated diversity, what happened to Israeli society on October 7th and since, and how that has affected each and every one of you and people around the world. Our goal is to build an indisputable historical record of the events that took place, for our time and future generations. This work is ongoing, and I'm happy to answer questions about it. But interesting things happen at the library beyond our traditional library work. And that is that we found ourselves crossing a border between documenting and commemorating. That the trauma was so deep that we wanted to create space for people to remember in a very active way. On the Shloshim, 30 days after October 7th, we started to build this memorial wall. And unfortunately, we keep adding. And behind the scenes, we created an index of all the people in Israel who were killed, or soldiers who fell, hostages that didn't return, and to create what's called a name authority record to identify each and every person. And we have shared this with institutions and initiatives all throughout Israel. And that is another way of understanding what it means to be the institution for the collective memory of a country. But it wasn't just about the memorial wall. It was often, also, as Tal mentioned, this gaping wound of the hostage crisis. And a colleague of mine, Dorit Gani, created this exhibition called Every Hostage Has a Story. She wanted to move beyond the symbolic power of these posters to fill out who are these people, the hostages. At first, 240, I believe, chairs were put around inside the reading rooms, and then over time, after the first round of hostages were released, we moved it to be able to be accessible from outside of the reading room, and it continues to today. And she chose a book for each hostage based on doing research about them, and sometimes just talking to the family, and in other cases, changing the books over time the more we learn about these people. Another new role of the library that we're experimenting with is how the library can serve a therapeutic role. You know, our documenting work has a therapeutic function. We find that people, especially people who are in the first circle of what happened on October 7th, when they know that their stories and their loved ones' stories are collected and are preserved and will be preserved for many, many generations, that it allows them to, this eases something in them. But there are many, many people who have turned their lives upside down. And so we started doing a program we call Ararat, Chosan Shebaruach, Resilience in the Spirit, to help the first responders, the doctors, the therapists, the social workers, to allow that the library becomes an intellectual, spiritual refuge, a haven for them as well. And the final role of the library, which is ongoing, is that we happen to be neighbors with the Knesset. We're in the national precinct. And as you've read, there have been ongoing demonstrations, sometimes day in, day out, in this neighborhood. And what we're watching is that how the demonstrators more and more are incorporating the library into their demonstrations. I just a few days ago watched as a group of demonstrators who were marching down Rupin Boulevard, they stopped in front of the National Library and they said, the library is what we're fighting for. The library is the symbol of what is good about this country, and that's where we're trying to go. That we are building a society based on culture of learning, of mutual respect, and that's why we have to keep marching. And so hopefully you're hearing what is ongoing of how the National Library is one example of Israel's cultural institutions that we are working in a very dynamic way to be present in the moment, but also to hold that center and also to build over the long term. And that's really what a library can do. And I think there's something very valuable about analyzing these strategies as well as strategies of partner institutions for thinking about how to rehabilitate the society. Thank you very much.
Some of us are not as tall as Raquel. Raquel, that was really lovely. It's very touching for me to listen. I know well the story of the National Library, and I'm going to mention why before I begin. But Raquel, it was very touching to hear you. My wife Tina and I were supposed to go to Israel on October 5th, 2023, to be present for the inauguration of the National Library. We stayed and we were going to travel on October 9, and of course it didn't happen. And when I next got to Jerusalem, which was in March of 2024, of course I went to the library, and it was amazing because, Raquel, that image didn't do justice to the reading room, the several tiers of the reading room going down deep into the center of the universe, and it was packed. There wasn't an empty seat. How many seats are in there? 600 seats. You had kids, you had high school kids, you had university students, you had pensioners, everybody taking a seat, because it was a place where you could feel that there was a kind of calm, and you could sense that there was still a center to the universe, even though there really didn't seem to be one. And, you know, we finished the renewal of the Israel Museum in July of 2010, and exactly right after that was when the National Library got going. And it doesn't often happen anywhere in the world, let's not talk about Jerusalem and Israel, where neighbors actually engage with each other, but we were gratified to be part of the process of identifying Herzog and de Meuron to be architects, and to be part of a discussion about how the library and the museum connected. Raquel didn't mention, I thought she was going to say our neighbors. Our neighbor was the Israel Museum. Instead, she said the neighbor was the Knesset. Not only, but the last image that you see of the unfurling of the biblical scroll that the library design is a metaphor for faces the Israel Museum. And the whole point was that the National Library should unfurl in the direction of the promenade up to the entrance to the Israel Museum. It did happen, and it was amazing. But anyway, thank you for all that. It reminded me of all that. Really, from Raquel, you heard about Israel from within. And if I were still director of the Israel Museum, you would be hearing from me about Israel from within, from the cultural perspective of a museum which is not the National Museum. Teddy Kollek was really brilliant. The Israel Museum is a 501c3 equivalent. It's just like MoMA, where my life started, because Teddy wanted the museum to have independence, not to be complicated by politics or religion. But still, its stature is national. And I would be talking about the narrative from there, from our perspective today, 18 months after October 7. Instead, I'm really going to focus on the Jewish Museum, where I was asked in the summer of 23, in August, if I would return to the museum world to become director of the museum. It's not something I was planning to do. I'd spent 44 years in the museum world, 22 at MoMA, 20 at the Israel Museum. I was quite happy engaging with the Jerusalem Foundation and supporting the amazing percolating social and cultural landscape of the future of the city. But somehow, and I'm not Moses, but somehow it's like, you know, Moses blunders into this burning bush, and then a voice says, "Is that you, Moses?" And you say, "Here am I," and then you're told what you're going to do next. And so I got this phone call which said, "You need to be director of the Jewish Museum in New York." I'm not a Jewish museum person, but I thought that it was that story, and I said yes. I felt it was a moral imperative. This was August of 2023. And I was supposed to start, I did start on November 1, and we were having a very smooth transition when suddenly October 7 happened, and I arrived 3 weeks later to the Jewish Museum. And so what I'm really going to talk about from here is not just, it's the Jewish world story from a museological perspective, but also with a focus on Israel after October 7, and the Jewish world's response from a museum setting to what happened on October 7 and how museums move forward. I am a modern art historian by training. My field is 1850 to the present, what happened in the middle of the 19th century that got rid of narrative and representation and shifted to visual vocabularies that ultimately would move to the notion of the aesthetic value of visual vocabularies. That was my focus. I'd never been to Israel. I was actually, it's a similar story, asked out of the blue in April of 1996 in the middle of Grapes of Wrath if I would become director of the Israel Museum. We had a bunch of reasons why we thought it was a great idea for me to make my first trip there, which I did on April 20th, 1996, in the middle of Grapes of Wrath. My whole thing while at MoMA was the notion of power of place, how a museum can be a success. I'm looking at Julie because they're about to open the new Princeton Art Museum because of site, setting, landscape, architecture, and architecture is the backdrop for telling a narrative. And you got to start with the narrative and then you build around it. And this was my experience at MoMA, and I arrived at that Israel Museum. You've all been there, you know it. And this is before we renewed it, but I was walking up the promenade, barely halfway up the promenade, and I was overwhelmed by the power of the site setting, the landscape, and the architecture of that place. I hadn't even gone inside, and inside was a real jumble. It was a kind of mess, but a mess with 500,000 objects that, if organized properly, could tell the universal story of the cultural narrative from 1.5 million years ago to the present all around the world. And I called Tina, my wife, halfway up the promenade, and I said, Tina, we must do this. I won't tell you what her first answer was. She called me back a minute later on her cell phone and said, you're right, we will do this. She thought, oh, you know, he's a romantic, we'll go for a couple of years, we'll come home. We went home 22 years later and had the privilege to rebuild this museum and indeed to turn it into one of the strongest examples internationally of universalism in a museum setting, where you do tell the story from the beginning of time to the present, and you really talk about this notion of connectedness across time and around the globe. We came home. Somewhere along the way, I started writing about this notion of universal museums and the antithesis being museums devoted to specific cultures, not just Jewish museums, but the notion that they do a disservice unless they really pay attention to what their experience in the global diaspora does to the work that they do. And, you know, Jewish museums sort of are at the front of the list there because Jewish culture has been in the global diaspora for 3,500 years. And I'm not saying, you know, it's better than anybody else, but it's longer than any other individual culture wandering in the global diaspora. And so when these guys called me in the summer of 23 and said, you need to come to the Jewish Museum, I'm looking at this building, you know, this white limestone neo-Gothic whale of a presence on Museum Mile. And I'm looking at it and I'm thinking, this is site setting, landscape architecture as the venue for telling an important narrative. You all know this history. You also all know that we operate under the auspices of JTS. Julie, thank you. Thank you and all of your colleagues. And the question for me was, what would that narrative be? And part of the reason why they called me is that I had started to write about the notion that Jewish museums were in a position to do something very special. And that was and is to look at their cultural narrative, not in isolation, standing apart from other cultures around it, but really to relate to the notion that Jewish culture has been in the global diaspora for 3,500 years, and it should tell a story which is about its resonance across time and around the globe with all the cultures around it, how it influenced and still influences those cultures, and how it is influenced by them. And you know, in a time when a lot of conversation is about diversity and inclusion, what I just described is a way that culture can and needs to be a narrative about diversity, about the mosaic of world cultures, and about inclusivity, the engagement among cultures. And that's why, before October 7, I agreed to take this role. October 7 did change everything. I arrived 3 weeks later, and really, at that moment, all museums, I'll focus on New York because we're in New York, the major museums in New York were experiencing an immediate conundrum, how to respond to this. And we needed to step forward. And what I'm about to do is give you a lot of images quickly. I'm a museum director. I come from the visual cultural world. Just absorb them because I want you to get a sense of how in the last 18 months, our Jewish museum has done its best to be responsive to the challenges of the moment by making this point that Jewish culture and a resonant connection with Israel and the challenges Israel is facing today are points that relate to this notion of the mosaic of world cultures and the resonance among those cultures. 6 weeks after October 7, I'd barely been at the museum, we made the decision to bring and show almost immediately the work of Zoya Cherkassky, who was a Soviet emigre at the age of 14 to Israel. She is now in her 40s. She's become quite prominent. Her work demonstrates a couple of things. One is she grew up in the Soviet Union. She knows art history. She grew up in the Soviet Union. She knows how to make art. Right after October 7, she did these really powerful drawings, a dozen of them, watercolors and drawings to show the horror of October 7. And we decided on short notice to bring them, and we opened on December 15. We didn't promote the exhibition in any way. We didn't want to seem to be opportunistic. We didn't want to seem to be taking advantage of the horror of the moment. There was concern on our staff and from other museum colleagues that we would be marginalized for making a statement. And the point was, it wasn't making a statement. It was that across art history, we all know this, artists respond to the trauma of their times, and Zoya's watercolors and drawings were incredibly powerful. If you know art history a little bit, you know Guernica. This is a first drawing. If you know Picasso's work from the thrilling time in the early 20s of women running on the beach, she turned that into the horror of kids running at the Nova Festival. These images immediately were embraced. The media responded in an incredible way, and we weren't taking a side, we weren't taking a position, we were just showing how art can be responsive in times like this. I hope many of you have been to Israel in the time since. This image of Zoya's became iconic because it is specifically the 16 kids, one of whom was killed immediately, 13 of whom were returned, and the 2 redheads are the Bibas babies whom we now know did not survive. This became a kind of banner across the country. It was one of her drawings. All the drawings have become large-scale works of art. We've acquired this one, and we've acquired all the drawings. And we made a statement which wasn't a statement. We said that we want to illustrate how art and artists can be important in traumatic times like this. And I'm going to run through the several exhibitions we've had since that moment, just to underscore that point. I hope all of you saw this exhibition, Draw Them In, Paint Them Out, which was Philip Guston in dialogue with Trenton Dahl Hancock. He's clapping, so he knows, you all know. First of all, Guston started, without the Jewish Museum, he would not have become Guston. He was part of the movement of abstraction in the early 1960s, sort of their PTSD recovery from World War II was abstraction. In the late 60s, he moved to figuration and his iconic image of the Klansman in order to respond to the social turmoil of the times. Fast forward 60 years, you've got Trent, and here, these are iconic images from our exhibition, which closed yesterday, of Guston's work from that moment in time. Trenton Dahl Hancock, 60 years later, a black kid from South Texas, from Paris, Texas, without knowing anything about Philip Guston, started to create work resonant with Guston's work. And once he understood who Guston was, he started to create works like this, his alter ego, Torpedo Boy, in dialogue with Guston's alter ego, the Klansman. And the point of the exhibition was to show that after 10 years in visual conversation, because they never lived together, these two in amorous embrace realize that you confront racism, and anti-Semitism is just one variety of racism, and you kill the Klansman. And this show has had incredible embrace, again, in the media and with our public, and this is one step. The next step is between Thanksgiving and New Year's. We were offered the opportunity to bring the Tel Dan Stele from the Israel Museum for 6 weeks. It was here once before, but no one paid attention to it. Why did we bring it? You all know, I'm not going to ask you to answer the question, but you all know that the Tel Dan Stele, it's like an analog Instagram from 900 BC, and it's a Mesopotamian king boasting that he had defeated the kingdoms of Israel and Judah, Israel in the north, Judah in the south, the kingdom of Judah, the house of David. So it's the oldest archaeological reference materially to the existence of the biblical house of David. Why did we show it? Because the house of David isn't just about Judaism, it's about Christianity and Islam. And we placed it in a display of selections of greatest hits from the museum. Look in this image to the left, you see William Kentridge. William Kentridge from South Africa is the son of Nelson Mandela's council. So his work is all about social justice. So he's on the left. And if you look to the right in the back, you see Kehinde Wiley's portrait of an Israeli hero who is actually a black Jew from Nigeria. In Israel, they don't have such high standing, and Kehinde gives this figure true stature. So we wanted to make that context for the Tel Dan Stele in the times that we're living in. We've just opened, I'm sure some of you have seen it, but if you haven't, you have to run, not walk, to see the Book of Esther in the age of Rembrandt. I mean, we all know this story. The first Temple diaspora went off to Persia. The Book of Esther sort of percolated from that moment. A bunch of that crowd ended up in Iberia. In 1492, they ended up in Amsterdam. In the 17th century, when Holland is becoming free from Spanish rule, Rembrandt and his peers embraced Esther as an example of the kind of bravery and courage and democratic spirit that the New Netherlands wanted to accomplish. So this is Rembrandt's depiction of Esther as a young painter in 1632. In this next image on the left, you see a peer artist of Rembrandt's depicting Rembrandt and his wife Saskia in the same posture. And we know that Rembrandt used Saskia as his subject for his depiction of Esther. Here you see Rembrandt's self-portrait on the left from the Isabel Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston. It's never left the Isabel Stewart Gardner Museum since it arrived there. And why is this self-portrait in the show? Because Rembrandt is dressing himself as a Persian. So all of this is about giving integration. It's like the intersection of art history and a narrative of the Jewish experience in the global diaspora, from the first Temple diaspora to Persia to the present time. In the present time, you can't be in the present time without thinking about and understanding the challenges of the moment that we're in. On other fronts, we're taking our story, which wants to be about 3,500 years of Jewish culture in the global diaspora, to encyclopedic museums all over this country, which in the past have not collected Jewish culture, and which in the last 18 months have started calling me saying, James, how do we build a collection of Judaica? And my answer is, you can't. The material is not out there, but we've got 14,000 examples borrowed from us. And so the first example is the Cleveland Museum, which I can assure you has no Jewish culture in its permanent collection. The director's a dear friend. He raised the question. I gave him the answer, borrowed a dozen objects from us, and put them in the context of the time and place when they were created. We opened this, you enter the Cleveland Museum and imagine you've got this billboard that says Jewish ceremonial art from the Jewish Museum in New York at the Cleveland Museum, and a map takes you throughout the galleries. On the opening morning, they actually closed the museum because they had such a response to an opportunity to hear the director of Cleveland, an encyclopedic museum, and me, the director of a culturally specific museum focused on Judaism, on Jewish world culture, to do a conversation. And then we went through the galleries to see these stunning examples. You know, a Torah case on the right from Baroque Italy in the Baroque Italian galleries, and Georgian Rimonim in the Asian art galleries, relating to the Islamic art that's presented there. And the design of the Rimonim is very similar, almost exactly resonant with the imagery that you're seeing behind it. So to get this message out is really important right now, because it's not that we are Jewish people in the diaspora and Jewish culture, that we connect only to Israel and not with resonance elsewhere. And the point today is to underscore the resonance. Beyond that, we're being even more adventuresome. If you can read Korean, this billboard at the entrance to the Noan Museum in Seoul, Korea says, Masters of New York, the generation of Rothko, Pollock, and Krasner, from the collection of the Jewish Museum in New York. Imagine, in Seoul, Korea, in East Asia right now, you see greatest hits of Abex and Colorfield painting from the Jewish Museum in New York. Here we are talking to the journalists who showed up for the press preview, looking at Jackson Pollock, looking at Miriam Shapiro, and these folks, not them, their grandparents, in the 50s and 60s, experienced when, after World War II, our country, in order to become more internationalist, created the USIA to take depictions of the new spirit of the country exactly because of what abstract expressionism and color field were about, the democratic spirit of our country. They didn't have a budget to send real pictures, so they sent like magazine covers, posters, and books. This is the first time in East Asia to see Abex and Colorfield work from the US. And you know, where did it come from? I don't want to say it didn't come from OMA because I'm a loyal alumnus. It came from the Jewish Museum in New York. So this is what that story is about. Now, a quick shift. What are we doing in our own museum? And we actually started in this past September, and we will finish by this September, a total rethinking of our collection galleries. And we're not going to talk about archaeology, Judaica, ceremonial art, fine art, contemporary art. We're going to integrate. And this is what it's going to look like. And you're going to get there and you're going to think, I'm in the Jewish Museum in New York. This gallery will be about ritual. This gallery will be about that incredible moment of Abex and Colorfield. This will be about feminism. This will be about the contemporary moment. And then you'll ascend to a floor which is going to demonstrate that you use collections like ours for teaching and learning. We live in a moment of, xenophobia and ignorance, and you want to demonstrate how 120 Hanukkah lamps from Asia to the Americas, from antique to the present moment, aren't about Hanukkah lamps, they're about the meaning of light. It's not just for Jews. Here you'll understand how these floors connect to each other, and that's what that story is. And I will end with the following, which is very important to our discussion. I hope even a little bit of a segue. Those of you who follow the Venice Biennale may know that there was a big story about the Israel Pavilion. It was a real challenge to get it open. It was ready to open, and it was so clear that the protest and response would be so vigorous it might destroy the pavilion and co-opt the message of the artist, which was about these incredible Iron Age fertility goddesses and relating them to 3,000 years of women struggling with fertility and the meaning of motherhood. And Ruth Petir, the incredible artist, did an amazing work where she animated those figures going through fertility, going through the challenges of fertility today, harvesting eggs, IVF, and so on. And the exhibition was ready to open. Because it was after October 7, she did add a video work that was about women marching in solidarity. And maybe subliminally, it was about protesting actions of government at that moment, but it was really about the biblical notion of women embracing one another for a march of solidarity. It is stunning. It's stunning. It didn't open. We, the Jewish Museum, were proud to acquire it. We got a lot of attention for doing so. Forget the attention. It was our pride. in demonstrating our endorsement of this kind of art activism in challenging times like this. And I'm delighted to say that 3 weeks ago, I had the privilege of accompanying the artist who's standing next to me on the ramp at the Tel Aviv Museum, because after the interim ceasefire was announced, we decided with the Tel Aviv Museum to open this in the homeland. And we went to do so, and here you see her walking down in this challenging, dark moment in Israel where everyone is really struggling. 800 guests showed up, and here is Ruth coming down to greet them. So all I want to say is that navigating these times in our cultural world, it has a lot to do with underscoring this point that our position is to be engaged and to show the resonance of our culture with all other cultures. And you know, for us to buy Ruth Patir, it's not because she's Israeli, it's because what she did was brilliant. And it was a true example of activism through art. And the more we use that, the better. And I'm sorry if I took too long, but I felt it was important to say all that. Oh, you know what? She's now 100 and a half. Hey, we were on our way down for her 100, and it was October 9. You might remember that Hurricane Milton decided to make a beeline for Sarasota, Florida, where she lives, on October 9. So we couldn't go for 2 weeks after, until 2 weeks after.
Raquel, James, thank you so much for such rich and very moving presentations. I think that you've given us a real sense of the ways that not just your institutions, but I think engagement with the original object more broadly can enable us to imagine possibilities for a future that we don't yet know, to cite some wisdom from the earlier session. So I have a few questions to ask the two of you, but feel free also to ask questions of each other. And then at the end, please, we welcome questions from the audience as well. We all know too well that much of what we're living and working through after October 7th is exceptional and unprecedented. But wartime collecting and curating are unfortunately not new in Israel, nor is the challenge of grappling with traumatic memory new to Jewish history. So I wanted to begin by asking you, as you have found yourselves making decisions about collecting, display, and programming in the wake of October 7th, how have you, consciously or unconsciously, or how have you perhaps observed artists, consciously or unconsciously, as we've already, I think, gotten a taste of, drawn to longer traditions of bearing witness to trauma? Are there sort of sensibilities from the past around difficult histories that have guided your approach or your sensitivities?
Thank you. That was so inspiring and phenomenal, James. And I think that it goes back to this idea of cultural institutions holding that center and going back to core values and the value of situating Jewish culture in broader conversations, in dialogue with other cultures, is so important today. And so I salute you in everything that you are doing in New York, as you did for decades in Israel. The work we're doing to document October 7th feels very, very different from previous attempts, but we have mined history extensively because we want to be very thoughtful about how do we craft collective memory. What's different about this work is we're in a digital age. And so for so much of Jewish history, if we go into the particular experience of Jews for a moment, for much of Jewish history, it was about gathering the fragments. It was about finding a document. There's the famous Oneg Shabbat archive of Emanuel Regenblum from the Holocaust. That's such a treasure trove because he was collecting in real time during the Holocaust, and he put 3 caches in different places, hoping some of them would be found. 2 were found. And the reason why it's so valuable is it was so rare. You think about stories about the Crusades. We know about them from chronicles, from poems. When it comes to October 7th, we are inundated with material and information. The acts of October 7th were horrifically physical, but the documentation is almost exclusively digital. And there are 2 aspects of digital that are distinct. The first is the sheer quantity. We've collected until now about 50 terabytes of material, and we have a lot more to do. 50 terabytes is in the hundreds of millions, if not billions of documents. I mean, we're when you think about, there's nothing to compare it to. We're collecting thousands and thousands of WhatsApp conversations. We have moment-to-moment unfolding of what happened on October 7th, that no one ever had access to that in the past. We have 200,000 videos from Hamas GoPro cameras and from the street cameras from the different kibbutzim and yeshuvim. Nobody ever had access to that material. So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, digital material, ironically, is much less stable than a piece of paper. And the reason why we got to work on October 9th was because we all watched in real time. Everybody here, we all got a lesson of why we need to do real-time collecting in the digital age. Because, as I think many people, if not everyone knows, for example, Hamas uploaded videos on Telegram at the beginning of October 7th. 12 hours later, it was gone. There were websites we collected right after October 7th that 3 weeks later were gone. We're the only ones that have it. And so that's very distinct. On the other hand, we're very mindful of what are the ramifications of collecting so furiously, so much, so quickly, without any perspective. And so I think a lot about the work that was done after the Kishinev massacres in 1903. It was a remarkable effort by Bialik and Dubnov and others to go, and they did real-time collecting. But they were so horrified by what they found that Bialik used the raw material to write his poem, Ba'ir HaHariga, in the city of murder, that became a seminal moment in the beginning of the Zionist movement. And the polemics around that poem brought more people into the Zionist movement than almost anything else, took over from the documentation. And so for us, that was a kind of warning sign of how do you hold that center? How do you maintain that line between historical record collecting and all the different kinds of agenda-driven work that we are surrounded by? So that's just, I can go on and on, but I'll stop there for a moment.
You know, it's really touching, actually, listening to Raquel and the whole thing during my years. As I walked up that promenade, part of what got me is that great as MoMA was and is on 53rd Street between 5th and 6th, and I can do a whole thing about power of place there. It was very important. But in my 22 years there, no president of the United States ever came to MoMA, even though they passed right by to get to an event at the Hilton Hotel. And I get to Jerusalem, and first off, I'm looking at this Israel Museum, and it sits surrounded by the Knesset, the Supreme Court, the Givat Ram campus of Hebrew University, and now the National Library. And you know, it's a statement that these enterprises are the core of the country. They're the core of Eretz Israel. And you know, it's very moving to understand that. And you know, for me, it's this whole thing about word and image. You know, it's about writing and creative making through art. And so this is a whole other day-long seminar, Julie, about the merging of words and images. You know, Hebrew manuscripts, this is a whole big other thing. But anyway, it's very important to keep in mind that kind of resonance, which is really demonstrated there. And you know, when Raquel started just now and she spoke of humanism, on my first day, November 1st, 2023, and you know, it's a little delicate. My demographic isn't the demographic from which museum directors for major museums are being hired today. And I was, and our board, JTS is on our board, said to me, you have to write a message on November 1. And I struggled for hours. And then the message was that we condemned savagery and brutality and called for the restoration of humanism, which is the core of our being. Museums exist to be the custodians of the heritage of world culture. Without humanism, you have no heritage of world culture. That we would make an action plan, and you saw images of what some of that plan has been about. And that is what rests on us as our responsibility. And you know, specifically answering Julie's question, part of our action plan is I do monthly directors' talks generally with artists, and I always end by asking them, how is the trauma of this period going to affect your work? Because if you're an art historian from my period, you know that World War I produced art and surrealism, World War II produced abstraction. And I would say, I say that, and then I say, and what's it going to do to you? And they, all of them have said, except for, well, no, I'll get to Zoya. All of them have said, it's too early to tell. And it's true, you know, Dada and Surrealism didn't happen on January 1st, 1919. It took a decade. And ABEX happened in the 60s. It didn't happen in the late 1940s. And so that's something where you need to have patience and pay attention. But the difference between words and images is that the words started to appear in these depictions, you know, the posters. And I'm not using ephemera in a demeaning way, but that's ephemera. And libraries have to deal with that. And we are really challenged with a lot of sources wanting to gift ephemera to us. And we say, that's not for us and that's not now. And we need to take time and we need to wait for that. Flip side is we are seeing, I hope some of you at least went to Pace Gallery when Michal Rovner had her poppies there last spring. There was an intervention, there was protest, there was vandalism at the gallery. She produced these poppies responding to October 7, and we've acquired them. And it's because they're brilliant. It's not about ephemera, it's about, you know, a lightning rod strike that couldn't have more power of the moment. And Ruth Patir's work, when you do see it, when it does come here, after it finishes its world trajectory, same thing. And, you know, you can identify, you have to have the antennae to know when there is a moment when you seize it and you really don't wait. And that's quite an important distinction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I'm going to transition from a question about, in some ways, temporality to a question about voice. And the question has to do with whose story is getting told, who gets to decide what story is told. There's a tension in some ways between the archive that has to be selective in some way. You can't take all the ephemera, but your particular institution's commitments to diverse voices, to diverse intellectual traditions, to all the books on the shelf. So I'm wondering, how do you operate in that complex space to strike a balance? How do you ensure that the full spectrum of perspective, experience, expression that makes up Israeli society, including minority voices, are preserved to give voice for the future?
You know, it's challenging. And the point is, for art museums, it has to be about the quality of the product, if you want to call it product. It has to be about the quality of the creative making. And if it has quality, as I just said about why did we buy Michal Rovner and Ruth Patir? Because they're amazing works of art. Brilliant. Alas, Ruth Patir really is the Queen Esther of the cultural landscape of today. She sacrificed showing a brilliant work that would have won first prize because of her commitment to this notion that others shouldn't co-opt her narrative. And at the moment, in the arts, you want art activism not to be about the sides. You want it to be about how the challenge of the moment produces creative making. And so you have to be very, very careful on that point. And So my answer is, it's a challenge for us because you want to select because of the quality and the power of the work, not because of the message it's delivering.
This is a core issue for me personally, and it's something that has been unfolding at the library. I mentioned that the library is a microcosm of modern Israel, and so you really can trace the stages of development of the library's collections as how Israeli society had and has defined itself. What's important? In some ways, libraries, in some areas, libraries don't make choices. So for example, we have the legal deposit law, and our goal is to get every single book or publication that is printed physically or digitally in Israel. And so there we talk about getting the entire spectrum without judgment, including quality or agenda. There are certain areas. But then when it comes to an archive or a manuscript, we can't take every piece of paper produced in Israel, right? We have to exercise judgment, and then valuation steps in. When I first became head of collections about 4.5 years ago, and I presented to the board about my vision of building the collections, I showed a list of our archives. And as I was scrolling through, I asked the people sitting around the table to identify what was there and what was not there. And it was very clear that what was not there were the voices of women. There were maybe 10% of our archives. We have 1,500 archives. It's gotten better in the last few years, but 10% women. When I first started at the National Library, we had 0 Arab archives. 0. Arab archives, 0.
Really?
Really. But I want to be transparent and clear that that was a reflection of previous generations of Israeli culture. We had very few Mizrahi archives. That's just a representation of what was valued in Israeli culture. And so now the question is, and it goes back to, James, your point, in that now what do you do? Do you go all the way to the other side of the pendulum and say, from here on in, no more white male, no more Ashkenazi Jewish men? So my personal position is that revolutions end up throwing out a lot of value. And so we have to take a more measured but insistent response of, and you can get a little arbitrary, right? So we set goals, and we've set a goal, 2 Arab archives a year, at least 2 women's archives a year. But you can fall into a little bit of a trap, and you have to work double and triple to make sure that you're identifying quality material, because in the end of the day, the goal is to build a great collection and not just, one that checks boxes. And so this really is an ongoing process.
It's really interesting because, and this comes back to a point we made at the beginning, you're the National Library. And our visionary, Teddy Kollek, was something else altogether. He wanted the Israel Museum to be an encyclopedic museum of global stature. The N-word wasn't in there. And when the Islamic Museum opened in Doha about 15 years ago, I was the guest of honor because we at the Israel Museum were among the few encyclopedic museums that historically had collected Islamic art. And, they kept writing to me, and I didn't go on junkets. I was too busy, and I kept not responding. And then the director of the National Gallery in London called me and said, James, you really have to respond. They want you there as their special guest. And it's interesting. When the N-word is there, it's not just about quality, but there is a perspective. There's a position. Day Day's kidnapped posters. Have you accepted those to the collection as ephemera responding to October 7th?
We're building an encyclopedic collection of October 7th, and we really want to collect the entire spectrum, including we've done dedicated work to collect Palestinian discourse, the experience of Arab Palestinian citizens of the country, and to the best of our ability to get the experiences of people in Gaza, which is definitely an ongoing challenge. There's another dimension to this, and that is for us, in being a national library, and again, that dialectic is all the time in front of us, it's not just about our choice. When it comes to certain communities in Israel that don't feel part of the national story, then one of the reasons why we didn't have archives of Arab cultural figures, it wasn't just because the National Library wasn't seeking them out, but also because Arab cultural figures didn't see the National Library as a trusted repository. And so that's this ongoing process. And we actually built, when I got to the library and I understood the situation we were in, it became clear that it was going to take a decade till we get our first an archive of an Arab cultural figure. And it, in fact, took a decade. And that was, how do you build trust with different communities? And we've done similar parallel work with the Arab community, with the Ethiopian community, with the Russian community, with Haredi communities. And that's, to me, what it means to be a national library today. How do we, in fact, put our arms around the entire kaleidoscope of Israeli culture and society? Also true for Jewish communities around the world. We do parallel work. We want the mainstream, we want to get the key dominant figures, however defined, and that's work that my curatorial team does all the time. But we also want to make sure to encompass and to document Israeli society and culture, Jewish society and culture, and of course, Islam and the Middle East, and humanity as a whole.
It's so interesting how the idea of an institution holding collections in the public trust, as we often just say, has such poignancy in this particular context. So the examples that you've shared over the last hour and so the pristine architectural images that you've shared with us could suggest two possibly sort of very different roles for the pictures of the role of the museum or the library, broadly speaking. One is as a space for pluralism and for dialogue. This is the model of the library or the museum as a town square, an agora with all of its debate and its polyphony. At the same time, there's that long tradition of holding museums and libraries apart as sacred spaces, as spaces of pilgrimage, as spaces of escape, spaces of solace and reflection. And so in the present, I wonder, how do you see these qualities of debate and of respite coming together in the now? Is this a matter of either or of both and in what you're observing? Or is it a dialectic?
These are wonderful questions, Julie, and I have really appreciated being in dialogue with you about thinking about our work and your work as well. I'm sure you have ideas to share, and I would love to hear them. When we opened the library and it filled up, and thank you, James, for sharing that image of 600 seats being so full that we had to bring in folding tables at one point, which was a little bit of a travesty to the architecture, but it was a quality problem. One of the problems we experienced very early on is that families wanted to come to the library. Teenagers were cool with teenagers, which is just a miracle in and of itself. But they're noisy. And at first, it being Israel and, boundaries being more of a guideline as opposed to a rule, so then people would run around the reading rooms. And we found ourselves in almost a philosophical debate in the management of the library. On the one hand, how thrilling. On the other hand, this is terrible, right? And how do you find that balance? And so, it's easy to say both and, but the way in which we try to work is to, and the way the architects brilliantly built the building is to be able to exist in parallel. And so when you walk into the library, it's very noisy, but the reading rooms are silent. And so we've taken many steps to try to gently protect that space, because we do need that space. Society needs spaces of quiet contemplation, of being able to be a step apart. But a library and a museum today, if we're not extraordinarily open, engaging spaces, it's over. It's over. One of the funny things that we're seeing is that children, when they come to the library, we expected children to come into our exhibitions, and we put all these electronic toys all over the place, interactive toys. We find that children are actually attracted to the authentic manuscripts, because in their world, they're surrounded by toys all the time, but they don't get to see anything, like real, like a 1,000-year-old book. That's meaningful, or manuscript. The grown-ups, they want to see they play with the toys, and so libraries can be, you don't think of that, but a library today is just this place of tremendous potential and dynamic adventures, and that's really the space we want to do while protecting the sacred space for scholarship.
I should say the National Library is ahead of the game on this point, because libraries don't know what to do now. And, the question before about being a library or a museum in the virtual age, for libraries, it's a real challenge. For museums, it's actually, it's interesting, and we think a lot about this. Audiences to museums traditionally have been self-selecting. It's a sociological thing. But virtual age means that you can get all this virtual tour stuff out there, and then all kinds of families can decide that these things are accessible, and there then is an enthusiasm to see it in real life. It's to be actual, not virtual. And that's one point. And you'll get there. It's easier in a museum setting because you're not talking about the written word and ephemera and the different ways to collect and preserve the written word and to experience it. You're talking about objects. But the other point is architecture can support this. Since you've all been to the Israel Museum, coming as a total outsider, a challenge for me in Israel is visual and oral, that's A-U-R-A-L, clutter. And why did we create the route of passage as the way into the museum? So that everyone coming in would shed the noise of the world outside and be calm by the time they ascended to enter the galleries. And you can go there anytime after October 7th, as before, and all those kids shut up. And there's something about that walk and the cleansing of it that really offers the opportunity to achieve composure personally and then be open to a different experience. Someone needs to write about this because it's really something exceptional. And for the library, it's a challenge because Herzog and Demron did a great job, but as Raquel said, the point is you get in off the street and you're right in there. And it's interesting, if you haven't been yet, there's all this acoustic fabric padding everywhere, and it's to absorb the sound so that as they're coming in, even if they're still noisy, no one hears it as much as they might otherwise. So these are sensitive points. And I have to come back to one thing you said before about bringing these other cultures in. It's not just being conscious of the need to bring them in. You need, and your curators, and I know you're working on this, need to learn how to interpret material that comes from a culture that's foreign to them. And this whole idea of thinking about and remembering that none of us is indigenous. We're all from somewhere else. Everybody lands from another planet. We're all foreigners. We're all strangers in a strange land. And the biblical narrative about this is exactly about fresh eyes and about behavior and all that stuff. And what you do in the library and what museums need to do is underscore the importance of recognizing that. It gives you a kind of humility, it diffuses xenophobia, and for a museum and a library, it allows you to realize how you have to be open to understanding and interpreting things foreign to you.
I would say that there's a distinction between a library and a museum, especially in terms of this, capturing and documenting the full spectrum that is of value and a principle with us. And the challenge of how do you do that in a way that's, dare I say, authentic, demands that the staff of the library had to change. And so over the course of the last 15 years, when I started, there was one Arab staff person at the National Library, and now there are over 40. And that's the way, so it's not me trying to learn the language of another, even though I've been studying Arabic for over 30 years. But how do you, and it was a goal of the heads of the library that the staff of the National Library would reflect the population of the country. And that has shaped the way we think about a lot. For example, in the exhibitions of the library, at the end, we created a beautiful table to help people have the experience of an archive. And when I use archive, I distinguish between a manuscript, which is a handwritten book, and an archive, which is like the inner window of someone's process, right? Choosing who gets to be around that table, right? We've over 1,500 archives. I talked a little bit about the challenges of receiving a historical collection of archives. And then, if we were just going with who's the most, prominent, famous, significant, the first time we did a sort, so it led to a very specific demographic around that table. And then we did another set of rounds, because the goal is to balance between showing the greats, but also we want people to find themselves in the library. And it has been magical to watch people come to the library and walk around that table and find, who can they connect to. And so we're in this really interesting balancing act. And to me, it's again a metaphor for how do you shape a culture so that it can be both aspiring to excellence all the time and also responsive to the dynamics in a community, in a society.
You've set us up very well for my final question, so thank you. And that has to do with museum and libraries' role in relation to civil society and democracy. In our prep conversation that we had about a week ago, you both shared really poignant examples of civil disobedience in your midst, examples of intentional disruption that your institutions not just had to contend with, but you worked to find meaning in. So you don't need to recount them necessarily, but I think this suggests a larger question about whether museums and libraries can or should maintain political neutrality. And it also raises a harder question about the role that these institutions should be playing in upholding democratic values. Can they or should they be holding the state to its own claims of democracy? And since this is our last question, and because it is a big one, there's no expectation, of course, to answer it, but feel free to sort of use this as an opportunity to offer some concluding thoughts.
We live in a moment when graciousness and mutual respect are out the window. That wasn't a political observation. And it's a challenge, though. And, it's true. Actually, Raquel's already talked about it, about how you get people into this library setting, and no matter where they come from sociologically, the point is to understand how to behave in that setting and how to be respectful of why others are there with you. And it's about convening and being places of convening, and museums need to behave this way. You've all seen in the newspaper how museums in New York became a kind of lightning rod for disruption, protest, vandalism. We are the only one that has not experienced that, except once, when Zoya Cherkassky, whom we've described, came to do a director's talk, and a very radical left art media journals set up a moment of disruption, and it only lasted 3 minutes. And the audience became enraged. I mean, our security team knew exactly what to do. We knew to be calm. And 3 people got up and read a manifesto, and they were quietly taken out. 2 minutes later, 3 people got up and read the same manifesto, and the audience started to say, "Shut up and sit down." By the 3rd time, the audience grabbed the papers, and they were ushered out. And Zoya Cherkassky took the microphone and said, I'm sorry, I was brought up in a different time. I won't use the F word. She said, those they're rich kids who know nothing, and I'm glad they're out. And the audience cheered, and we moved on. And you know, our settings need to be settings where this notion of graciousness and mutual respect is there. And you know, that's for everyone, not just Jewish world culture. But what are we supposed to be? We're supposed to be a light unto the nations. We need to set an example for how this kind of behavior is central and essential. And we're doing it in the museum. And you know, we don't put up a billboard that says that, but we are deliberate and conscious of the importance of doing it, and we're doing it.
If you were to walk into the new library with me, before we walk through that door, I would turn around and introduce our neighbors on the other side of the Israel Museum, and that is the Knesset. And I say that I like to believe that the people in the Knesset look at us, and it helps remind them what they're working for. Libraries and museums are barometers of democracies. When the democracy is healthy, institutions thrive. When democracies are under threat, and we see it all over the states today, libraries and museums become these battlegrounds. A few years ago, the Minister of Education tried to introduce an amendment to the budget law in order to take over the library. And very explicitly, he planned to fire the board and install his own. This is in Israel, and I know that there are echoes in America as well.
As we speak.
As we speak. There was such an extraordinary groundswell of support throughout Israel that it was exhilarating. Thousands of academics, thousands of writers, all but one of the Nobel Prize winners, almost all of the Israel Prize winners, you're wondering who it was. And there were even people who said, I don't know what the National Library of Israel is, but I love it. And it goes back to the symbolic role of our institutions and the broad understanding of the function that they play in a democracy. I don't believe in neutrality. I don't think that it exists, and certainly doesn't exist in Israel, and it certainly doesn't exist in a national library anywhere. When I first started working at the library, and I naively assumed the National Library of Israel is like the National Archives here, and I had a painful awakening, but it's honest. It's honest. What I described about the history of building archives at the library is honest. And so the work is not to maintain neutrality. The work is to constantly aspire to do better and constantly aspire to build richer and more expansive and more authentic ways to document and celebrate our cultures and our societies. A little while ago, I wrote an article for a beautiful new book to celebrate the new library, which is called Library and Open Book. And the article is called Libraries Must Be Free. And I outlined 4 different aspects of freedom that need to be in a library. A few are obvious. Libraries should be free, as in it doesn't cost anything to walk in there to allow access to information. A library collections need to be free of bias, to make sure to not censor. But then there's the more aspirational role of freedom, and that is that the public face of a library should reflect the diversity of its collections, and that's complicated. And it's especially complicated during wartime and in trauma, when there's this very natural tendency to shrink back to your tribe. But that's the work. That's the work that you're doing. That's the work we're trying to do at the National Library, to keep opening up and creating more and more space so that we're very proud of 30% of our educational programs in the library happen in Arabic. And we're talking about East Jerusalem students and teachers, the most political contentious part of the country, that they love being in the library. And so I see it as an aspirational trajectory as opposed to declarative.
Beautiful.
Thank you.
Thank you. Rabbi Gordon has some questions from our audience to moderate.
We have a number of excellent questions. The The session was supposed to end now, but lunch is starting at 1:45, so I'm going to take a few minutes, and hopefully we can. I'll read two of these questions, and hopefully they can be answered in the time that we have. I should add one more thing, talking about libraries and exhibitions. We have a wonderful one here that's listed in the program. During the break, the oldest Jewish book going back about 1,300 years in our library, and you're very welcome to go through it. So one question is, the world of humanities, including on university campuses, has not been dealing with the October 7th trauma in a way that is as understanding and nuanced as the examples you've provided here. How will this be resolved when there's so much antipathy toward Israel and the Jews, especially in fields like literature? And another question is that many cultural institutions have been mentioned here, but the questioner is curious about the way in which Yad Vashem may fit into the conversation. You can take them in either order.
The second is easy.
So
It's an interesting question about Yad Vashem. Right after October 7th, we were in touch with them, with Yad Vashem, and they expressed their own ambivalence about what their role is, right? At the beginning, you probably remembered that the language of Shoah was used often. And then over time, which I think was the right, responsible reaction, that language has kind of dissipated because there's no comparison.
it's important that you just said that.
And the Yad Vashem leaders were ambivalent because of that, because they felt that if they stepped in, it would invite that comparison, on the one hand. On the other hand, they had more experience than anyone of how do you document trauma, catastrophe, massacre. And so they did something that I regard as very noble. Behind the scenes, off the record, they became a partner of ours, and they trained a group of interviewers to collect 123 testimonies, oral testimonies. And those materials were deposited in the National Library as part of a much larger corpus of thousands of testimonies that we've collected and we're continuing to collect. And so to me, that was an extraordinary act of generosity and professionalism that they did. And then they decided to step off the stage because their continuing presence really locks in this comparison. And so it's a wonderful example of where an institution understands its mission and therefore where it shouldn't be. I give you the first question.
It's museums devoted. When I said at the beginning that I was asked to comment on why Jewish museums don't work, and what I and many colleagues now understand to be the path we need to take so that you start to see Jewish culture in context. For Holocaust and memorial museums, it's much more difficult, but they do need, and I'm not being critical of Yad Vashem, but I'm saying they do need to do the same, because as much as that trauma holds for us a certain critical space in our thinking about the history of Jewish people, you need to start to think about how other cultures have similar experiences so that you can begin to get a sense of shared understanding of what those experiences mean in each of those cultures. And it hasn't happened anywhere yet, and it needs to. And it was admirable that Yad Vashem took a step back because it wasn't correct. This comparison was not correct. And on the other hand, it was challenging anywhere in the environment of the moment to say that. And what they did was admirable, but what they should be doing as the next step is thinking about how they put what they exist to preserve in our memories as history in the context of similar experiences. For of experiences that other cultures consider to be similar?
Maybe I'll just say one sentence about the question. I think that it goes back to what, James, you were saying about timing and process, and that is, it's very early to be thoughtful about October 7th. It's very early to be nuanced about this. And when we started collecting, we were mindful of the fact that we were beginning a project that we didn't know where and when it was going to end. And that was very uncomfortable. Certainly libraries don't like to do that kind of work. We like to wait for the dust to settle and figure out retroactively what's important. And, you know, as you mentioned these other historical examples, that it takes a little while. And so I'm not surprised that there isn't nuance. Campuses are battlegrounds. We're actually doing a specific collection process on North American campuses and trying to capture the full gamut of responses. And that's really challenging work. And so I'm guessing that we're going to start to see more nuanced perspectives in how do you teach this material. And one of the reasons why we feel an urgency to collect and open access as much as possible is to help facilitate these more nuanced conversations. Maybe I'll say that one of the values of this material sitting at a library is that that we are inherently set up to provide broader contexts. For example, we're doing a dedicated project with the Gaza border communities, not just to collect what happened after October 7th, but to help them tell their own stories, because they were not born on October 6th. Some of them were celebrating actually 70 years on October 6th and 7th. And so we're helping them digitize their whole archives in order to situate October 7th in a much broader history. And I feel that that's critical for Israeli society, which we're so deeply, and probably until the hostages, please God, come home, it's going to be very hard to get out from under it. But the rehabilitation work that we need to do in Israel is how to start situating October 7th in the broader regional context and in the historical context.
With deep gratitude to James and Raquel, may you all find freedom in museums and libraries. Thank you so much for being here.